we have a very skewed sense of our relationship with microorganisms in general and bacteria specifically. They collectively outweigh human beings by 100 million times. They can replicate 500,000 times faster than we can. And they've been doing this for 1,000 times longer than our species has existed.
We've just touched the corner of understanding the diversity of the microbes that are out there. We've barely scratched the surface. And we need to understand this because, again, they make plants functional. They affect the movement of methane and hydrogen and nitrogen and phosphorus. They affect the carbon fixation and the plankton in the oceans. Viewing them as important players in our ecosystem in the same way people have viewed forests and grasslands would probably make us treat the world in a better way.
My name is Robert Beam. I'm Jesse's father.
I'm Christy Beam. I'm Jesse's stepmom.
And then just step out for a second and we'll pull this up.
We were actually at cross-country camp.
See how tall you are.
I think it was the second day he started developing a fever. The following day we came back here to Kentucky.
Step away.
And he was really getting dramatic with him. Jesse Beam does not do sick very well, so he was I thought he was playing it, and he was kind of moping around the house and crawling at one point out of his bedroom, and I told him to get up, and he did, so you think he's playing it. Next day while I'm at the office, he calls me, wanted to go to the hospital. So I called his pediatrician, and she said, get him in here right now. Finally got us a room, got an x-ray. They found pneumonia in his right lung. Figured that was what we were dealing with, so I called Christy and told her, we're in the hospital, he's got pneumonia. She's trying to calm me down, told me not to worry about it. Kids get pneumonia, they'll be fine. He'll probably stay in the hospital for a day or two. All night long, he just kept getting worse and worse. His temperature would get pretty high, or at least his body temperature was high, but his oral temperature was never really spiking real high. He started hallucinating around 4, 5 in the morning. And that's when I went to help him go to the bathroom, and when we stood him up, his front was really clammy and his back would almost burn your hands. And I told the nurse that. So she came in and they had to do a rectal temperature, and his internal temperature at that point was 105.9. She called in the critical care team. His pediatrician showed up, who made the call that he needed to be at a pediatric hospital. Again, I'm still thinking pneumonia. So I told Jesse I was going to run to the house, get him some clean clothes, get him his games, and I'd be down there to Vanderbilt. And about, I don't know how much longer it was, but I was about Goodlettsville when they called me and told me that they were there, they'd made it. Jesse made the flight well, but his body was doing a lot of work. That's when they told me they put him in a coma. We started with daptomycin, then we went to clindamycin, then we went to vancomycin, which he finished off vanc upstairs.
Yeah, well, and he was on all three at one time. And that's whenever they told us that, look, he's on all three medicines. We've done everything we can do.
If the bacteria doesn't stop growing now, then there's nothing else.
There's nothing else we can do. We've got nothing else to pull from.
Antibiotics are basically poisons that kill bacteria and don't kill us.
They often have some effects on the human body as well, but for infections, it's going to do one of two things to a bacteria. It either kills it or it makes it stronger.
But what we do with antibiotics, because we give the wrong doses of antibiotics to people, or we give the right doses, but people end up dosing themselves incorrectly because they don't take a full prescription, or because we give antibiotics to healthy farm animals. What we do in all those situations is we set up a sort of Darwinian battleground within the body of the human or the animal who's getting the antibiotics, in which the weak, susceptible bacteria are knocked out by the drug, but the strong survive.
And it unfortunately occurs more rapidly than you might think. Because they go so quickly as a community of organisms, if there's a way to become resistant, they can find it.
About 3/4 of the way through my fellowship, we began to see just an explosion of highly resistant infections, and that was concordant with it happening all over the country and the world. There's nothing unique about our setting. And I remember the first patient that I took care of who had an untreatable infection, could not be treated. And it was a woman in her 20s who had 2 small kids, who had leukemia. Sorry. And she developed an infection in her blood by Acinetobacter. So we started treating it with the drug that we had left at the time, which was a drug called imipenem. That was the big gun. That was the last ditch. And she looked like she was getting better at first, but then the infection came back, and it was resistant to the imipenem. It developed resistance in the middle of a course of therapy. And when it came back, I have this just vivid recollection of looking at the computer screen. And you see a printout on the computer screen of all the antibiotics that the bacteria is resistant to. Resistant, 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 resistant. And there was nothing. It was resistant to everything. And I couldn't fathom how in the 21st century, an infectious disease specialist would run out of stuff. I mean, this is, since penicillin, we've expected that we're going to have relatively inexpensive, safe, tremendously effective drugs to treat infections. And this woman had returned to 1935. She had returned to the pre-antibiotic era. And she died. And there was nothing to do.
Antibiotics were the only thing we ever had in all of human history that really stopped infectious diseases. And we took that just miraculous, precious substance and we completely squandered it. And it astonishes me sometimes that we don't ask ourselves, how is it that we squandered this and why can't we stop?
I came home from work one afternoon. I'd been working under a boat all day painting, and I was extra stiff, my back hurt, so I thought, well, maybe I'll get in the bathtub. We have a jacuzzi tub, so I filled it up with hot water and got in it, and that's pretty much the last thing I remember.
But I remember.
Yes, you remember.
We also thought that we might be sore because we were training really hard for the Molokai to Oahu outrigger canoe race, which is pretty intense workouts, and my back hurt. So I called to make an appointment for him to see his regular doctor. And from there, he went for CAT scans and tests, and the CAT scan showed that he had lesions on his spine. They had discovered it was methicillin-resistant staph, so he was on vancomycin, and it was an emergency situation to open him up and clean those out.
Apparently I picked up this staph either from the water in the marina or surfing next door at Doheny, which is right adjacent to the marina. Between the sepsis and the surgery, I've lost use of my legs. You know, I haven't really taken the time to grieve about it too much because, it's too much to grieve.
Do this without my pants falling off.
I've always been able to bait my own hook, and I can't do that anymore. It's hard. It's really hard.
This is a man who was surfing one day and had his spine open the next day from a resistant infection. And I think the thing that's come home to me is it can happen to anybody, anytime, anywhere. Nobody is safe.
Don't get me wrong, antibiotics saved my life. I'm really grateful for them. But I do feel that the likelihood of me getting this was probably because of our sort of rampant use of antibiotics in the first place.
It's clear that people don't quite understand the extent of the usage of antibiotics in our everyday life. We know that they're used on farm animals. Do we know that they're put into household products, sanitation products? Do we know that some 300,000 pounds are sprayed on fruit trees?
On kitchen counters, in our wall materials, school cafeteria trays, on everything.
To supposedly improve their antibacterial activity, but for what?
Virtually all the antibiotics that have ever been used have come from organisms that are in the world around us, from soil fungi or from something growing on bread or other organisms that are out there. And they've been in a struggle for existence for billions of years. And we have just come in at this last minute, basically, and said we're going to take those chemicals and spray them into the world around us in these massive doses. And what happens is that most of the microbes will, in fact, be killed by some of those chemicals. And the ones that survive now will be resistant to the chemical that you threw at it. So you throw another chemical at those microbes, and most of them are killed again, and some survive, and they will now be resistant to both of the chemicals that you've thrown at them. And if we keep going down this path, the microbes in the world around us will be resistant to most of the chemicals that we can throw at them. And now, if one of those microbes also happens to cause disease, then we have nothing left in our arsenal to throw at it, because we've wasted all of these tools at everything.
People talk about antibiotic resistance taking us back to a pre-antibiotic era. And what I think they are envisioning when they say that is the way things were in the 19th century, the 18th century or earliest, when people died of infections because they tripped and fell in front of the plow that their oxen were dragging, or they fell into the works of the factories of the Industrial Revolution. And people say to themselves, well, we don't have that anymore. We don't farm with oxen and plows. We don't have huge, filthy factories like that. So we're not really at risk. But what they don't think about is that most of the structure of modern medicine relies on the deployment of antibiotics. If we didn't have antibiotics anymore, if we went to a pre or a post-antibiotic era, there would be no transplants. Heart infections might kill 50% of people again. Childbirth might be much more dangerous. To take antibiotics out of the medical system is to shut down a good part of the medical system.
Penicillin was our first real antibiotic. That is, a substance made by another biologic creature which is able to inhibit the growth or kill another biologic creature.
1928, Alexander Fleming leaves a window open in his laboratory, and something blows into the window and contaminates his culture plates. And when he looks at them 2 weeks later, he can see that there's little dead zones in the staph, and the mold at the center of the dead zones turns out to be the source of the penicillin.
While he surmised that this was an important finding, he could not see it as a therapeutic.
Then, two other British scientists, Dr. Florey and Dr. Chain, began developing its usefulness for fighting infection inside the human body.
So during the First World War, many more people died of infectious disease than died of actual battle wound injury. During the Second World War, antibiotics had just been introduced, but then scaling up production to a mass scale, which would allow many soldiers to be saved by these drugs, required someone to figure out how to make these.
Dr. Florey and an assistant, Dr. Heatley, came to the United States to start a search for new sources of penicillin. Agents from the Department of Agriculture were instructed to send moldy foodstuffs from every part of the country. One day, it led to a moldy cantaloupe. The mold from this melon gave 200 times more penicillin than any that had been tested before. This was the turning point.
Penicillin was tried in different environments and different places during the war, and a need from the military was to have some of this wonder drug for venereal disease, which was rampant among the military groups.
We average 30 venereal disease cases each year out of every 1,000 men in uniform. That means 300,000 men put out of action each year in a 10 million men army. And every one of those men is a casualty, as far as combat is concerned. Think of that, 300,000 casualties without even a battle. Well, I'm sorry to have to run out on you, Colonel, but I'm swamped with work. Thank you, Major. Goodbye. Goodbye.
The question was, at a time when you have a miracle drug that's saving lives in hospitals in London, can we really allow it to be used for the results of playing around in the military? And the story goes that Winston Churchill was involved in that decision. And while it wasn't direct, there was a little notation on the side of the request. And that was Churchill's sign that, yes, let's save our military, but let's not make a big announcement about it.
Let me put my banana in your fruit basket, and I'll be satisfied.
So penicillin arrives, and it's a miracle drug. People who would have died of things like blood poisoning are now cured in 48 hours. The problem is, we almost immediately overuse it.
When I first got interested in resistance, it was because of penicillin resistance in gonorrhea. And it turns out that the origins of penicillin resistance in gonorrhea were from brothels in Vietnam, where the US Army had given out penicillin to all the sex workers.
Not to treat, but to prevent venereal disease in the soldiers.
This indiscriminate use of the antibiotic drug has contributed to the appearance of a strain of gonorrhea completely resistant to penicillin. The new strain was first detected in this country last year in infected military personnel returning from the Orient.
So it was, in fact, someone's decision to protect the military from getting the disease that led to a strain and eventually a whole number of strains of the bacterium which were no longer controlled, killed by penicillin.
And as a result, now penicillin doesn't work for gonorrhea for the most part.
Alexander Fleming, the man who discovered penicillin, warned the medical community in a New York Times interview in 1945 that physicians were wasting penicillin. We need to understand, why is it that physicians overprescribe antibiotics? Because if you're going to fix that, you need to understand the root cause. The reason docs overprescribe antibiotics is fear. It's not so much fear of being sued, it's fear of being wrong. It's fear of, I have a patient in front of me, there's a 95% chance that this patient has a virus. There's still a 5% chance that it's a bacteria, and they have exactly the same symptoms. I can't distinguish with any certainty beyond that. Well, it's just this, one prescription isn't going to ruin things, and what if I'm wrong about this patient? It could really hurt her or him if it's not a virus, and I don't give an antibiotic. I'm just going to give the script and give them the antibiotic just to be sure. If you don't address that fear that occurs at that moment, when that patient is the physician's responsibility, not society at large, then it's not going to work.
Where that gets really challenging for us as providers is that when we see patients who have cough and fever and are missing school or missing work, we feel a need to be able to intervene, to be able to cut those symptoms short and get people back to health. Since we don't have good therapies for viruses, we tend to focus a lot on those bacterial infections that we do have antibiotics for. The problem is that for every patient that we treat with antibiotics, we're breeding a certain sense of resistance in the community. That's fine for infections that absolutely require antibiotics, but where we really get into trouble is that we prescribe antibiotics for maybe 5 people, maybe only 2 or 3 of them actually need antibiotics, and in only 2 or 3 of them will those antibiotics actually make them better faster.
We need things like rapid diagnostic tests. So when this patient is in my office, I run a test and a printout comes out and it says, oh, this patient has a virus. Now I have no more fear. Now I'm comfortable explaining to the patient, you have a virus, we don't have any treatment for it, but it's just going to go away. You don't need an antibiotic.
If you have a cold, stay home. Stay in bed. This is the prescription which common sense and medical science recommend.
And that feeling of being ineffective, that feeling of not being able to cure all ills is sometimes really tough. I've taken care of several teenagers over the past few years that have suffered from community-acquired methicillin-resistant Staph aureus infections. In all of those situations, I remember at least one moment where I had to tell the family that I didn't think their child was going to survive this devastating infection. And that's typically done in an environment where the child's on a ventilator. They may be on a cardiac bypass unit called ECMO, where we're doing all of the work for them, doing the work of the kidneys and the heart and the lungs. It's usually after a very grueling week or maybe 2 weeks of antibiotic use that is not effective. And it's usually in the setting where I have the conversation that we've been able to have some victory over the bacteria, but because the bacteria was there for so long, and because the inflammatory response was so great, that things aren't going the way they need to be.
It was within a day that they had come back and told us it was an MRSA blood infection.
They think it was in his nose, and they just started floating through his bloodstream and found a weak spot to attack, which ended up being his knee. Then it attacked his lungs, and then it just eventually started attacking all of his organs.
He'll probably need other surgeries. And growth plate on his thigh bone and his femur is involved in all this, so it's not growing. So this leg's shorter than this leg, so probably down the road we'll do something to lengthen, to equal the two out.
You want me to get a couple more?
I think this will do it, Susan.
Okay.
Could you put family in a room, please?
The hardest part, I think, was walking in there that first time and seeing your child laying there with medicine all behind him, and
Lord.
wires and machines, and only enough room for you to walk by his feet, and you can't do anything. I mean, and we just felt helpless.
I don't know, I was like, because I mean, you know, nobody wants to think about, you know, death. You know, you don't want to die. But, I mean, I just knew, like, it was getting to the point, I mean, I knew it had to be serious. They wouldn't just fly me down there for no reason. And I don't know, I kind of gave up, I guess.
Any more?
Like, the stuff I still take for granted, I'd say is school. But things I don't take for granted that I used to is, like, before all this happened, like taking a shower. The first time I got back in the shower, I was in the hospital, and my dad was helping me, and I cried, because, you know, that was the first time I felt the water, like, hit me on the feet.
You know, this has affected his life, and long term, you know, he keeps thinking, I'm going to be better in a month or 2 months or 3 months, and it's hard for him to try to wrap his brain around the fact that, you know, he's got plates and screws and pins in his leg, and his lung is shrunk, and
Does that hurt?
There's always going to be that fear of what happens if. What happens if he's 20 years old and something starts going wrong with the sutures in his lung? You know, what happens if he breaks that leg again and it's chronic osteomyelitis and it never heals and it's always going to be broken? But I think overall, I want him to get the most out of life. There's something out there. There's some reason this kid was not allowed to go. And I can't wait to see what it is.
To make a difference to antibiotic resistance, the thing that we have to do is to stop misusing antibiotics. We have to stop misusing them or using them inappropriately in human medicine, and we have to stop misusing them and using them inappropriately in agriculture. Why do those two things keep going on? I think it's really two different situations. I think in the case of medicine, it's mostly just inertia, that medicine is a big, complicated enterprise, and it's hard to get new best practices, I guess they would say, into the hands of hospitals and to convince everyone of what has to happen. But in agriculture, it's a different situation. You hear over and over again in agriculture, we're not really sure if the use of antibiotics is contributing to resistance. Yes, it is. It's not a scientific question anymore. It's a question of politics and it's a question of economics, but it's really not a science question.
Agriculture believed that with antibiotics, they could grow healthier, fatter animals quicker. And then it evolved to the fact that they found that they could keep animals in some pretty deplorable conditions, unsanitary, unhealthy. But if they put some antibiotic in their food every day, they felt that they were stopping the animal illness. Now that's about the same as trying to sprinkle antibiotic on your children's cereal every morning. It makes about as much sense.
Today, agriculture is going far beyond nature to produce new miracles for an even better, more abundant life.
Well, we produce 9 billion food animals in the United States every year. So those are animals that we raise for meat. And those 9 billion animals, most of those are raised in concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, and given regular doses of antibiotics. What we know is that about 80% of those antibiotics are used non-therapeutically. They're used to make the animals grow faster and to prevent diseases that may just be occurring because of the way we're raising them.
It's as if someone said, what would be the best way to come up with a novel pathogen that we can't control? Let's get a bunch of creatures together, let's put them together in close quarters, let's put them literally over their own manure, let's feed them the same thing, and let's, just to sort of ramp it up one, let's put daily small doses of antibiotics. So we're making sure to select for bacterial strains that can survive these antibiotics. Let's do that.
It's got a support your local farmer sign there that, he just does that because he can. He knows he's not a farmer, he's an industrial pig producer. They're still working on that last building back there. Like I said, there's a 600 head, a 1,200 head, an 1,800 head, and now another 1,200 head facility. But if you looked in the building, you find somewhere between 1,100 and 1,500 head of hogs that are packed together in tiny little pens. They're standing over a concrete pit that's 8 to 12 feet deep. Antibiotics are in their feed, in their water, and then if there's any sign of coughing or whatever, they're also injected again, and they do not leave until they're ready to go to a truck and be butchered.
Wherever livestock are kept, food bills always account for a large proportion of the cost. A bird or animal is not a very efficient factory for converting animal food into human food, and anything that will help to improve the efficiency will add to the profitability. In this, the animal food industry is helped by the specialist's laboratory.
Back 50, 60 years ago, they found that if they gave very low levels of antibiotics, the animals would grow a little bit faster than if they didn't have the antibiotics in. We don't know why. We didn't know why then, we still don't know why now, but we know that that does make the animals grow a little bit faster. So that's why it started happening, and we've really grown up the industry with putting those low levels of antibiotics into the feed.
The finding was at Letterly, where the company was making a tetracycline for use in people. The mash from the tetracycline was given to chickens and other animals and noted that they seemed to grow better for the same amount of protein. Well, it turns out that The substance doing the growth promotion was none other than trace amounts of the tetracycline left with the carcasses. Then the industry said, let's just add it back to the feed. And so penicillins and tetracyclines especially were added back to feed for what was then called growth promotion, later called feed efficiency, and now being re-examined because in fact their extended use is a mistake.
For large corporations, what they want to do is get as much meat out as quickly and as cheaply as possible. That means putting antibiotics in for growth promotion to keep the animals from getting sick, and the whole thought of treating the animals gets to be almost secondary.
Iowa is the biggest hog producing state in the United States. And it's really interesting to look at what happened in Iowa over the past 25 years and the way that the place that hog farming had in Iowa changed over that period.
Eric D. produces 2,000 hogs a year on his factory farm. He has traded in his slop bucket for buildings where the temperature is controlled, the feed automated, and the overhead expensive. In order to be profitable, this assembly line must run non-stop.
We didn't find this system of technology. We were forced to look at this system of technology if we wanted to stay afloat.
So between 82 and 2007, we go from 50,000 farms to about 8,000 farms. 85% of hog farms in Iowa went out of business. The other ones scaled up dramatically. The price of a hog went from $240 in 1982 to about $109 in 2007. So you saw the remaining farms were making way less profit per hog, and that is one of the reasons those farmers are so protective of their right to douse their hogs every day with antibiotics, because they've got so many of them, they've got such tiny, tight, micro-thin profit margins that they're under severe pressure to produce as much as possible, as fast as possible.
I'd love to be able to say that we should only give antibiotics when they're absolutely 100% necessary. But right now, in certain industries, the poultry industry, the swine industry, it's an economic necessity.
Confinement agriculture, as it now exists, could not exist without antibiotics being used the way they are now used. So if you took antibiotics out of that system, or if you even dialed back their use, the system would have to change. And people within that agricultural system say it's not worth the cost. Well, tell that to a mother whose child dies of an antibiotic-resistant illness. It's certainly worth it to that mother.
April 16th, 2004. It was a Friday, absolutely regular, normal, every day. And that morning, around 6 in the morning, my son, who was 18 months old, my son, whose name is Simon Sparrow, let out this shriek. And he wasn't acting himself. He was kind of under the weather. But I just thought, oh, you know, he's 18 months, you know, kids get sick, he'll be fine. But my husband had a sense that something was very serious. So he said, you know, I'm going to bring him to the emergency room because I really feel that there's something wrong here. And I actually thought he was overreacting. I thought, okay, yeah, go to the emergency room. I'll catch up with you later. You know, I had to get my older daughter ready for school. And then I arrived. My husband said that the emergency room folks had administered all kinds of tests, but no worries, he's fine. I can go home. At this point, he was increasingly having trouble breathing. And then right in the middle of the afternoon, I touched his cheek and his forehead, and they were ice cold. And I completely freaked out because I was used to fevers. Like you touch a forehead and you can tell, you know, when a child has a fever because it's so hot. But I had never felt ice cold on a child's head. So I freaked out and I called the doctor at the emergency room, and I explained what was going on, and I had her actually listen to his breathing, and it was kind of like, and she said, hang up the phone, call 911 immediately. And when the two men from the ambulance came up to our apartment, they did another series of tests. They said, you know, he's fine. And at that point I felt kind of embarrassed, like, oh my gosh, I exaggerated. I'm making much ado about nothing. You know, it's fine. We can go home now. But then the medical technician said, no, because of protocol, once you're in the ambulance, we have to take you to the emergency room. So we went to the emergency room. And then suddenly I had a flood of healthcare people surrounding me and Simon. And they kept repeating, your child is very, very sick. Your child is very, very sick. And I was about just breaking down. And then they were asking me questions like, has Simon been to another country recently? No. Has he been to a farm recently? No. Has he had all his immunizations? Yes. And then they said, well, we have to take him to the intensive care unit. And then finally, when I was allowed in, Simon was in a bed with all kinds of tubes connected to him. He was intubated, and the doctor, the attending, explained that he's having a lot of trouble breathing. And she said, you know, the only thing that we know is that your son has an infection and he's very, 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 very sick. So you need to plan to be here for a long time. And then they brought us into where he was lying down in bed, and there were at least 10 medical doctors, and they said that the only chance that he would have was if they put him on this machine called the ECMO machine, ECMO. It's a heart-lung machine. So of course we said, okay, let's bring him to this machine. And it was very, very difficult to see this because they had to elevate him so that the machine would work better for gravity reasons. And my husband stayed by his side the whole night. He was on a stepladder and he was stroking his hair, telling him about all the things that they would do together, like fishing and all the things, skiing, all the things that my husband wanted to do with Simon. And, you know, in the middle of the night, I was just so beside myself. I really felt like that Simon had already died, and I really felt like I needed to go back home to where my daughter was so I could spend some time with her. And then I went back at 6, 7 in the morning, and that's when the doctor said that there was really no chance that Simon was going to make it. And at this point, my son was completely transformed physically. He was completely bloated. He had purple splotches all over his body. He had purple tears coming out of his eyes. I mean, he looked totally like a different being altogether. And we agreed to take him off this ECMO machine, and that's when he was pronounced dead. That was April 17th, a Saturday. And everybody was just completely stunned. No one knew why he had died. And, you know, we had to live with that for about 2 months when we were waiting for the autopsy results. And that's when we were called in and we were told that Simon had contracted this antibiotic resistant bacterium, and it was a new strain. It was a community associated strain, not a healthcare associated strain, and it was a strain of MRSA staph, specifically methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And that's why when the doctors had given him a broad spectrum of antibiotics before he died, nothing was working. And what is so frustrating, even to this day, 9 years later, we have absolutely no idea how Simon contracted this bacterium. We don't know even where. You know, it happened in less than 24 hours. You know, really don't even have the words to describe, you know, how we felt after learning all of this.
In the 70s, the FDA expressed serious concern about antibiotic resistance on farms. But by that time, the practice was so entrenched and the interests involved were getting so big and powerful that the genie was already out of the bottle.
Today, the Food and Drug Administration said that unless drug companies can prove their safety, a number of antibiotics used in poultry feed will be banned as of next year, and there will be a similar ban on food for hogs, sheep, and cattle by mid-'73.
When something that is approved by the FDA is not shown to be safe for human health, FDA has to stop the approval for that drug.
We're creating resistant organisms that may ultimately transfer that resistance to organisms that cause human disease.
But do you think the use in animal feeds constitutes a sort of health hazard where there could be a severe epidemic?
Absolutely.
And when FDA made those findings, those obligations followed. But for the next 35 years, action stalled.
It's a very complex issue, and there continues to remain, gaps in the understanding. And I think that has driven the inability to kind of move forward. Is that those gaps, over the numbers of years, have always been pointed to and say, well, we don't have definitive enough data, so therefore we shouldn't take any action. And I think that's been the thinking up until more recently, where I think we've been pushing for moving forward in a more, with a strategy that says, well, look, we understand there are some gaps in the science, but there is an awful lot we do know.
We've tracked for decades now outbreaks associated with particular types of food animal groups and with products from food animals. And if resistant bacteria are causing those infections, then we've got to think about where the pressures were exerted on those bacteria to, number one, develop resistance, and to, number two, get into the food supply.
This is not just a theoretical risk. What we see is that most of our meat and poultry in the United States are contaminated with drug-resistant bacteria. So for just example, if you go to the grocery store and you want to buy some ground turkey, you have about a 1 in 300 chance of finding a tube of the ground turkey that doesn't have drug-resistant bacteria in it. But this year something came out that really grabbed my attention. So this year we saw one package of ground turkey had a salmonella strain in it that was resistant to all 8 drugs that were tested. So we may be looking at pan-resistant salmonella. So most salmonella infections are self-limiting. You're uncomfortable for a while, you use a lot of toilet paper, right? But you usually survive. But when this is pan-resistant, if your immune system cannot take care of it, you're very likely to die of this. Right? It's because your physician doesn't have any other options to treat you with this.
In response, FDA has chosen to focus on voluntary measures, essentially recommendations to industry that industry is free to follow or ignore.
It enables us to work in a collaborative way with the industry in a cooperative way, so that we can move forward in a productive way to get this issue addressed, but at the same time make sure that the products, these products continue to be available to the animal ag community, and then we make the change in a real deliberate way, and it gives us some ability to phase it in over time, and pay attention to what those collateral effects may be as we move forward, implementing the changes.
Over and over, we see the influence of money in politics. And what it really comes down to, I think, is that when these industries consolidate and more and more of the industry gets tied up into fewer and fewer hands, you get these massive companies. They make massive amounts of profits, and they invest some of those profits in their lobbying effort.
Our idea there is that if these two antibiotics could be limited, then their usefulness in veterinary therapy and in human therapy would be preserved.
Feedlot operators fought that ban and won. They argued no conclusive link has been established between antibiotic use in animals and human disease. But the government says that's no longer true.
It isn't just the meat companies who have massive amounts of power. It's the animal pharmaceutical companies that make lots and lots of money selling this stuff. They have a vested interest. The fast food industry, they don't really care how it gets made. They just want to be able to offer their triple cheeseburger or their meat lovers pizza at a price that keeps consumers coming back. They're against these kinds of measures. And so you get these powerful economic interests lined up with lobbying power And it really isn't that big of a mystery why we haven't seen very much change.
Well, now that we know the extent of the problem, let us consider what can be done about it. Is it a necessary evil? Is it something science is unable to fight, or is it simply too powerful for the human race to cope with? I was born in Denmark. Some years ago, I went back for a visit. I was amazed at their progress, and I took some home movies. Well, you can see for yourself how Denmark attacks the problem.
In 1992, Denmark make an agreement with the English people. They don't want antibiotic growth promoters in the food for the pigs. And in 1995, it was a ban in Denmark that you may not use antibiotic growth promoters for food. In 1998, it was a ban in Europe, but I think it was 2004 it was stopped to use antibiotic growth promoters totally in Europe. But in Denmark, we started already in 1992. 200 females. Can you hear? 200 females. And no one screaming.
As soon as we started looking after it, we could see that this resistance was all over the place in our food animals, it was in our food products, and it was actually also in healthy humans in the community in Denmark, even though there was extremely limited amount of use on the human side at that time.
There was a public debate on whether this was a human health risk that we used these antibiotic growth promoters. And finally, the industry decided that we could probably still have a profitable production without using the antibiotic growth promoters. So in order to, you could say, accommodate the public and our customers, we decided that we would ban them voluntarily. It's an industry initiative. It was not the government. Later on, the EU banned antibiotic growth promoters, but that was 7 years later. So it was simply because of a discussion in the public about whether this was a problem.
Well, the question is, does their system work any better?
Bottom line is that today we in total use approximately half the amount of antimicrobial agents as we did before the ban, and we produce 50% more. And at the same time, resistance has gone down really heavily.
I will not say I love that ban, but the result coming out of the ban, I love that. I'm not organic producers, but I love not to give more than necessary.
You have to balance out what are the costs and what are the benefits. AGPs, when we stopped using them, we could see that mortality went up just a little bit, daily growth went down just a little bit, but it was not something that was the end of the industry. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. And I mean, we produce more pigs today than we did 12 years ago. Way more pigs.
Well, of course, we hear this argument all the time that this might be feasible to do something in a small country like Denmark. But come on, Denmark is producing 28 million pigs every year. That's basically the same amount as the state of Iowa does. I think it's about 30 million pigs. So if we can do it in Denmark, of course you can do it in Iowa. And Iowa is probably the state in the US that produces most pigs. So it's not so difficult. It is actually feasible. And of course you can scale it up to any state in the US.
It sounds like ABC, doesn't it?
Well, it's that easy, and it's up to you.
I don't know about you, but I hate the idea of the Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes thinking we're a bunch of superstitious idiots. Let's show them we're as adult and intelligent as they are. Let that be our plan of conquest, the conquest of disease.
There is no government agency that feels empowered, or indeed is empowered, to really watch out for effectiveness of antibiotics. And I'm not advocating the creation of a new government agency, but certainly if we didn't have government paying attention to the effectiveness of antibiotics, most assuredly there's no private incentive to pay attention to this.
If you want to design interventions to block transmission of infections, you got to know where the infections are. You got to know where the resistance is. You got to know where the antibiotic use is. Europe has developed a very sophisticated network, that's EU-wide. The United States is behind.
To really understand resistance and to really understand what's going on, it's probably more important to have granular information that allows you to look at, more discrete geographic areas, to look at the correlation of use with resistance rates that may happen at a more local level.
And what are the challenges to getting to that more granular level?
It's in essence, either accessing that information through vendors who do gather that information, companies such as IMS Health, other vendors that do provide such data, may provide a resource for those that are wanting to do research to look at the correlation of resistance with particular levels of antimicrobial drug use.
And and this may be a really naive question, but I think it's one that a lot of regular people would have. Like, why can't we just say, you have to tell us how much you use? Like, there has to be an accounting.
So I'm not sure I can answer that question exactly, but healthcare records, healthcare laws, it's not entirely clear to me, how that would happen. But the folks and I'm not sure this is really sort of something that will. Not my area of expertise per se as far as gathering all this data, but there are groups like IMS Health, Wolters Kluwer, other organizations, Premier Health, that are sources of this type of data. And through contracts with them, they can provide different types of data on antibacterial drug usage.
The political and economic realities behind why we have not set up a coordinated federal network that isn't just looking at one or two diseases at a time, but is doing pan-surveillance. I think those are real policy questions that need to be addressed.
If you do not have these data to show where you are, you don't have absolutely no clue where you're going. You cannot monitor what is the effect of the interventions you do. You don't know which kind of where you should target, what you should do about it, and so surveillance is really the essence, the basis of everything for anything you do, both before and also for the future.
You have to have an independent FDA and USDA and independent regulatory authorities to be able to look at these products, to analyze them on a continuing basis and call the chips where they may. And that sometimes creates political problems on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, but that is what the public expects.
This fight is probably the fight of a lifetime.
I don't think there's any question about that. If 148,000 people die a year of uncontrollable infections, we've got a problem on our hands, particularly since a decade or two ago. That wouldn't have been a problem at all. And it is up to us to stop it. And it is heartbreaking to me, not to say stupid, that we would take one of the most single advances in medicine in our lifetime, or in the last century, and simply waste it. And it infuriates me.
If you look now at our current antibiotic pipeline, I think that it would be appropriate to be concerned. There aren't nearly enough drugs coming forward.
If you're a pharma company and you spend 10 years and $1 billion, those are the usually agreed to numbers, 10 years and $1 billion developing a drug, and you bring that drug out, and within a year, bacteria are resistant to it. And within 3 years, a lot of bacteria are resistant to it. And within 5 years, maybe physicians don't want to prescribe your drug anymore because they're not sure if it's going to work in their patients or not. Why would you make that drug? How are you going to recoup that $1 billion? When you look at it through that lens, making something like Viagra or statins or insulin that people will take for the rest of their lives, that makes a lot more sense.
The second side of the coin is the regulatory. The Food and Drug Administration has completely changed the way that it looks at antibiotic clinical trials. And the reasons for this relate to very Byzantine statistical concepts. The effect is that companies know, A, they don't know how to get new clinical trials done for antibiotics. And even successfully completing those trials, you have a much lower chance of getting a drug approved now than in the past. So tell industry, tell investors that it's going to take much longer than it used to. It's going to be much more expensive than it used to be, and you're going to have a much higher risk of failure even if you successfully complete your phase 3 trials. And watch those investors run for the hills. That's what we've done as a matter of public policy in antibiotic development.
We need to encourage developers to be willing to bring forward antibiotics that might be antibiotics that we don't use very often. And I think it is not reasonable to expect new antibiotics to all be best-selling drugs. That in fact, if they become best-selling drugs, we're probably not using them correctly.
What we need to go after is thinking through where we're going to get our antibiotics rather than trying to fork over a lot of money to some big pharma company to come up with the next blockbuster, because what's that really going to solve? That's kind of like you have a new car and you drive it on a road which is really bad, so your new car goes bad, and so you say, well, what I really need to fix that problem is another new car. Now what we really need is a better road.
If we don't develop any new drugs for blood pressure in the next 50 years, that's okay. The stuff we have today are going to work just as well 50 years from now as they do today. But if we don't develop any new antibiotics, the nature of the beast is that the stuff we have today are not going to work anymore. That's bacteria using their genes to adapt. We have to develop new ones, or we will not have effective ones at all.
The tragedy of the commons exists when any individual who's using a particular resource, let's just call it fisheries, and you think, well, a problem with fisheries is that there is too many people catching fish because any fish they leave in the ocean is basically lost to them because someone else is going to catch it. And that's exactly the same problem with antibiotics, which is if I don't use that effectiveness, it's gone tomorrow because someone else is going to be using up that effectiveness. And in a sense, it takes the problem of antibiotics out of the realm of medical science, which it is a medical problem, but it's really a problem of behavior of individuals and of societies.
The overprescription and misuse of antibiotics is a classic example of the tragedy of the commons. If I was the only physician in the country that was prescribing antibiotics to people with viral infections, it would have almost no impact on the spread of antibiotic resistance among bacteria. When every physician does it, and when it's done in animals, it's done on a tremendously widespread industrial scale, that has a negative detrimental effect on society as a whole. And the time for bickering over half measures and debating the nuances is over. We're past all that. It's time to sit down in a serious way and fundamentally redesign the processes by which we discover, use, and protect antibiotics.
We can try and figure out a way to protect ourselves from the very dangerous microbes that are out there. And that probably will require us to accept some risk associated with life. That is, if we walk around into our environment, it's probably better for us in the long run to get exposed to the microbes in the dirt and on our mother and other places. So you sort of have to accept that occasionally some of them are gonna make you sick. And hopefully we'll have treatments that will allow us, if they make you really sick, to get rid of them.
The best quote that explains our relationship with microbes came from Nobel laureate Dr. Joshua Lederberg, who wrote in the magazine Science that the future of humanity and microbes will likely evolve as episodes of our wits versus their genes. Their genes allow them to adapt to anything we throw at them. It's up to us to use our wits to keep up with their genes.
In middle school, I saw a dog in a swimming pool. It's growing, yeah, it's growing, it's growing, it's taking over me. You shouldn't push up against it, don't move it, or you'll offend it. It's growing, it's growing, it's growing, it's taking over me. Sometimes it's only there, between the trees. It's growing, it's growing, it's growing. It's taking over me. It's the color of misplaced fruit. I hate to say it, but right now it's probably near you.